have some more Modern this week. Last week I played with a blue-white control deck that had the Thopter Foundry, Sword of the Meat combo in it, and I found that part kind of lacking. And this week, a buddy of mine tweeted out that he was 15-0 in his last matches with blue-white control, so naturally that piqued my interest a little bit. And I've been looking at the list on Magic Online and kind of just tailored a list to suit my liking, I suppose. And this deck is one that I have previously badmouthed, and I think for good reason. It's just kind of like a mix of cards. There's some tension between like the necessity for the sweepers like Supreme Verdict and Wrath of God and hard counterspell and Cryptic Command. So it's kind of weird. It's like on one hand, this is sort of a tap out deck, but then you just have some random Cryptic Commands in it too, which you kind of need. And obviously post board, like, that mostly changes. Like against the decks that you want the sweepers against, you probably don't have that many Cryptic Commands and vice versa. So overall, probably not a big deal, but yeah, I mean, the deck is still just like a pile of random cards, basically. But it is actually a pile of cards that I do think is pretty well positioned in Modern right now. Like, the big mana decks are kind of taking over, and this deck got a pretty big upgrade with Ixalan in Field of Ruin. So before, you would have to like Ghost Quarter a Tron deck or a Valakut deck or whatever, and you would just be down a land drop and you'd be struggling to catch up. But Field of Ruin kind of changes all that, and while it is more mana intensive, I don't think it particularly matters that much because you get the land untapped and can still play something like Mana Leak on time. So I think Field of Ruin is a big upgrade. This deck also has a 5th Field of Ruin in a singleton Ghost Quarter. You have 4 Spreading Seas, so you just have like a lot of natural hate for these decks. And you have a bunch of like hard counter spells that actually tag their big things. Plus you have things like Gideon of the Trials, which actually puts a reasonable clock on them. So overall, I think this deck is pretty good against those sorts of decks. And you have Path to Exile and Sweepers to deal with random aggressive decks, and counter spells to deal with all the combo-y nonsense. So you need your sideboard certainly to fix the holes with the bad matchups. In this case, like, I think Storm is probably pretty bad, at least in game 1, but you have plenty of answers for Empty the Warrens, which is nice, and a bunch of counter spells and additional clock pieces in the sideboard. So overall, not too bad. The mana base from the Magic Online list I changed slightly. Some of them were skimping on blue sources, which I don't think is a good idea. The one that I was working off had 17, and I mean, 17 is probably fine, but Cryptic Command is certainly difficult to cast, and I think once you're playing 17 blue sources, you're kind of just like banking on the fact that you're going to activate a Field of Ruin per game, which is not great because you might end up like wanting to fetch a basic plains at some point too, and you can't always have the Miser's Mystigate. So I do think that like third plains, for example, is probably a little bit not greedy, but just, I don't know, not really cognizant of what is going on with your deck. I mean, you could Spreading Seas your own land, I suppose, but that's not a great solution. So I cut a plains, added a second Hollowed Fountain. There were some lists that played an irrigated farmland instead of a second Hollowed Fountain, which is kind of cute, where you can fetch it in place of a Hollowed Fountain if you're just going to get it tapped anyway, and then like late game you could cycle it. But with all the Field of Ruins and Colonnades in this deck and relatively high mana curve, I feel like this deck basically just wants to be making all of its land drops, so actually drawing a cycling land at any point is probably just going to be worse than drawing a Hollowed Fountain. But other than that, the main base is pretty straightforward, pretty simple. A lot of the lists I saw only had 3 Flooded Strands, which kind of makes sense because you have like Colonnade and Glacial Fortress and Mystigate and all these just like naturally very good blue-white duels, and you're not trying to do anything too fancy with the mana base. But on the other hand, you also have Search for Azcanto, which you want to transform as soon as possible. So it's even possible that you could cut things like the Glacial Fortresses for additional fetch lands to help further along that process. And maybe that is actually correct, especially since I have a Logic Knot in the deck. But at the very least, I think the 4th Flooded Strand is kind of mandatory. The Moto list also did not have many Spell Snares, and certainly when you look at the list of the top decks in the format, Spell Snare I don't think has a ton of targets. Like, I'm used to Spell Snare being this card that basically every blue control deck plays 2 of, and even like a third would not be completely out of place, and Modern is not really in that spot right now, but I do think that there are enough decks that Spell Snare is good against, one of them particularly being Storm. So Just being able to spell snare their first ritual is like such a big tempo shift for you that I think it is worth just playing these because they're very rarely just absolutely dead, you know? Like Grixis Death Shadow doesn't have a ton of targets, but the ones that they do have, the Snapcaster Mages, are very high value, and kind of the same thing goes with Tron with Sylvan Scrying. So I do think that Spell Snare might be a card that I board out a lot, but I do think it is particularly good, especially in decks like these that start from behind. And then the rest of the counter suite is kind of random. One Logic Knot, one Negate, 2 Mana Leaks, and then the 3 Cryptic Commands. But I do like Logic Knot a lot. I feel that in any deck that is planning on playing a long game, like it would not surprise me if most games of this deck go past turn 8. I don't think that you just want a pile of Mana Leaks because eventually it's going to lose its effectiveness. So I do think that Mana Leak is probably one of the best counters, but having a Logic Knot as like a late game pseudo hard counter, I think, is very valuable. And you don't really lose much by making that swap. Obviously, there's some tension with Search for Azcanta, but I do think that either way, like if you have Search in play and a Logic Knot in your hand, you're probably pretty well off. So, 2 Gideon the Trials, 1 Jace Architect of Thought, 1 Gideon Jura, kind of a random-ish mix of Planeswalkers, but it is basically what everyone has agreed on as far as Magic Online is concerned. And I don't necessarily disagree with them. Like, I could see not playing with the Jace because of how many 4-drops you already have. But definitely 1 Gideon Jura at the top end makes a reasonable amount of sense. And the Gideon the Trials, I think, are pretty good against combo and pretty good just as a clock or a pseudo removal spell. And I'm pretty excited to actually get to play with it since I haven't yet. But yeah, you can't really play like too many of any one Planeswalker, so I do think that a mix is probably correct, but I do think that the Jace is probably the weirdest one to actually be in the deck. I mean, it is like another answer to Empty the Warrens and stuff, but maybe it's better off as a sideboard card, I don't know. A couple Detention Spheres just as a random catch-all, and then a Miser's Ruined Halo, which my buddy Mick Winsauce was playing with, and makes a lot of sense because Ruined Halo, especially in Game 1, shores up a lot of the bad matchups. Like you can name Valakut or Grape Shot and just like suddenly be okay against those decks where before you may have struggled. Obviously, there is some dyssynergy between Ruined Halo and Planeswalkers. Like you can Ruined Halo their Death Shadow, and then their Death Shadow can just attack your Planeswalkers. So that's not ideal. But overall, I don't think it's going to be the worst thing ever. I think if anything, like the Ruined Halo is probably going to win you more games than you're going to lose. And then a couple Snapcasters. So one of the most frequent questions that my buddy got on his Twitter screenshot was like, why are you playing 4 Snapcasters? It's like, you already have like Path to Exile and counterspells. Like that's good enough, right? And it's really not. Like in order for Snapcaster to be good, either the 2/1 body has to be worth it, or the spells that you're flashing back have to be good enough that you don't mind paying 3 mana for them. And certainly Snapcaster as a split card makes a lot of sense, but there are very few targets actually for Snapcaster to the point where like Snapcaster is not going to be a split card a lot of the time. Like it is going to be strictly a counter spell or strictly a Path to Exile, like whatever spell you actually happen to draw. So there, you lose like a lot of utility in Snapcaster Mage. Like this is not a card that you're necessarily going to be playing on like turn 3, 4, 5. This is more of like a turn 6 card, I think, in this deck, or maybe turn 5. But yeah, I don't think you want to flood on Snapcaster Mages, but I do think that there is enough inherent value in just playing a couple copies and just like keeping it light that 2 is fine, but any more than that is probably pushing it. And the other thing I want to note is that throughout Modern's history, there have been some blue-eye control decks that have played like Wall of Omens, Restoration Angel, and if the format were actually in a place where I thought Wall of Omens was a very good defensive tool, then I could see playing that package, possibly instead of some of the Planeswalkers, because Restoration Angel is decent, especially once you have access to Wall of Omens and Snapcaster Mage, but right now, I don't think the format is in that place. I would much rather stick a Planeswalker against something like Tron because it will probably end the game sooner, or at least put you far enough ahead to the point where it's very unlikely for you to lose. And then I have a Wrath of God instead of a Supreme Verdict, and that's basically for humans and their meddling mages, but not really that big of a deal either way. And then the sideboard is, you know, just kind of a mishmash of random things. I have 4 pieces of Graveyard Hate with Rest in Peace and Surgical. Surgical might not be correct, but again, like the matchups that you're scared of are the ones that are trying to like virtually kill you on turn 3. So having the cheapest form of interaction against those decks is super important, just like Spell Snare against Storm. So Surgical is pretty nice against Dredge, and you do have a couple Snapcaster Mages to make it a little bit better. And since you're blue and white, it's probably not a card that people would expect you to have. So you have that nice surprise element too. But Rest in Peace is obviously just like the best hammer that you could possibly play if you're just absolutely trying to hate on graveyards. And it might be kind of weird to bring in Surgical Rest in Peace and be trying to like Snapcaster your Surgicals. But if you have Rest in Peace in play, like that probably doesn't matter. And also in those matchups, I don't think you necessarily want the Search for Escanta, so you're fine with just boarding in the Rest in Peace. Have some more counter spells for big mana decks and for the combo decks like Storm. So 1 Dispel, basically because it is like one of the best cards against Storm, but in mirror matches or against Grixis Death Shadow, I don't think you would ever want more than 1 Dispel, so I don't really see a merit to playing a second one just for Storm. And the Spell Snares kind of cover that to some degree, where you have a reasonable amount of 1 mana interaction. The Negates, I think, are a better fit, even though against Tron, I'm kind of worried about their Thought-Knot Seers out of the sideboard, but you can just keep in all the paths, and maybe that'll be fine. Disdainful Stroke is kind of a hedge against the 4th Negate, where it also counters Thought-Knot Seer, and maybe some bigger spells that are actually creatures, like you could tag a Wormcoil Engine with it if you wanted to. The Vendilion Clicks, I think, are pretty good because it allows you to put a clock on Storm and Tron while also disrupting them a little bit. Otherwise, if you have to wait until you can drop like a Gideon Jura or start attacking them with Colonnade or whatever, like I think that just gives them too much time to actually set up. So having Vendilion Click as something that you can play early is great. A couple of copies of Stony Silence for Affinity and Lantern, I suppose. Random Condemn, which is kind of a hate card against Death Shadow, but is also just good against any random creature deck like humans. And then Random Settle the Wreckage. I don't know if the Settle is actually good, but it seems pretty nice against things like Eldrazi in the humans deck. And it's a Wrath with a different name, which is nice. And then we have the last card in the sideboard, which is basically my favorite in Crucible of Worlds. And this could actually be main deck, and I wouldn't be that upset about it. Like Crucible Flooded Strain is nice. Crucible Field of Ruin is great. So I could also see the mirror match revolving around Crucible a lot because it probably, like Celestial Colonnade probably just matters a ton in the matchup. So Crucible to main deck is not that crazy, but for now I'm going to keep it in the sideboard. So let's go.